Inside Stateville Correctional Center, the dark reality behind Illinois' most infamous prison. There's a prison in Illinois where time does not behave normally. Men enter as teenagers and leave as elderly strangers. Some never leave at all. From the outside, it looks like a relic. Circular concrete walls rising from the cornfields of Crest Hill, Illinois, like something abandoned by history. But inside those walls, Stateville Correctional Center is very much alive. Alive with tension. Alive with decay. Alive with secrets that were never meant to leave. This is a prison where entire housing units were condemned while inmates still slept inside them. Where cells designed for silence became breeding grounds for chaos. Where violence wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was bureaucratic, slow, and invisible. And yet, Stateville remains operational. Still holding thousands, still swallowing lives. Tonight, we are going inside one of the most infamous prisons in America, not through headlines, not through rumors, but through the architecture, the policies, the failures, and the human cost. This is Stateville Correctional Center, and this is the dark reality behind its walls. Before we step inside, take a moment to support this channel. If you're drawn to deep investigative prison documentaries, unheard inmate stories, and the hidden mechanics of America's correctional system, make sure you subscribe. Turn on notifications and stay with us. These stories are long. They are uncomfortable, and they matter. Now let's begin. A prison built to watch men rot. Stateville Correctional Center did not begin as a failure. In fact, when it opened in 1925, it was considered revolutionary. Its most famous structure, the Roundhouse, was designed on a radical idea: total surveillance. A circular cell house, 5 tiers high, cells stacked like cages in a human coliseum. From a single central hub, guards could look outward and observe nearly every inmate at once. This design was inspired by Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, a theory that if prisoners believed they were always being watched, they would regulate themselves. Control through psychology, discipline through visibility. But there was a flaw. The architects assumed the system would be maintained. They assumed staff levels would remain high. They assumed funding would continue. They assumed inmates would remain manageable. They were wrong. Because a structure designed to watch everyone becomes useless when there are too many people to watch, and not enough guards left willing to do it. Over time, Stateville didn't just age. It rotted. Paint peeled from concrete walls soaked in decades of humidity. Plumbing failed in cells never meant to hold men for decades. Electrical systems sparked inside walls built before modern safety codes existed. And the Roundhouse, once a symbol of control, became a pressure cooker. Sound carried endlessly. Arguments echoed for hours. There was no privacy, no silence, no escape from each other. Inmates would later describe it as living inside a drum. Every shout, every threat, every breakdown amplified. This was not just a prison. It was a psychological environment, and it was turning hostile. Overcrowding, when the system collapsed in slow motion. By the late 20th century, Illinois prisons were filling faster than they could be repaired, and Stateville became one of few facilities expected to absorb the overflow. Cells built for 1 man began holding 2, then 3. Bunk beds were welded into spaces barely large enough to stand in. Personal belongings were stacked under mattresses. Movement became negotiation. And with overcrowding came something more dangerous than violence. It brought neglect. Maintenance requests went unanswered. Medical appointments were delayed for months. Mental health units overflowed with men who were never meant to be housed in such conditions. Former correctional staff would later admit something quietly, almost shamefully. Stateville was never designed to function at the population levels it reached, and everyone knew it. But shutting it down was politically inconvenient. Renovating it was expensive, so the state chose the cheapest option. They kept filling it. Entire housing units were labeled structurally unsound, yet inmates remained inside them. Leaks dripped from ceilings into electrical fixtures. Mold spread behind walls inmates weren't allowed to clean. And slowly, lawsuits began stacking up. Federal investigations, civil rights complaints, reports describing conditions as unsafe, unsanitary, and inhumane. Yet still, Stateville stayed open. Because once a prison becomes essential to a state's population management, closing it becomes almost impossible, no matter how broken it is. But overcrowding didn't just damage the building. It changed inmate behavior. When too many men are trapped together with no space, no relief, and no certainty, hierarchy becomes survival. And that's when Stateville's internal power structures began to harden. Power inside the walls. Inside Stateville, authority did not end with the guards. It fractured. In some units, correctional officers maintained order. In others, inmates enforced it themselves. Informal leadership emerged. Certain cells became untouchable. Certain men were protected. Others were isolated without paperwork ever being filed. This wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was subtle. Who controlled access to phones? Who decided who could shower without problems? Who could move through common areas safely? New arrivals learned quickly. Official rules mattered less than unwritten ones. And those rules shifted depending on housing unit, staffing level, and tension on any given day. For guards, this created a dangerous balancing act. Intervene too much, and you become a target. Intervene too little, and control disappears. Several former officers would later describe Stateville as exhausting rather than terrifying, a place where burnout was inevitable. Turnover climbed, experience drained out, and when experienced staff leave a prison like Stateville, something fills the vacuum. Chaos. Pause point / cliff edge. By the early 2000s, Stateville was no longer just overcrowded and aging. It was officially failing. Federal courts were watching. The state was under pressure. And a decision was coming that would change everything inside those walls. A decision that would condemn entire buildings, displace hundreds of inmates overnight, and expose just how fragile the system had become. When the prison was declared unlivable. By the time federal inspectors returned to Stateville in the early 2000s, the language in their reports had changed. They were no longer talking about deficiencies. They were no longer recommending improvements. They were documenting failure. Entire sections of the prison were officially classified as unfit for human habitation. Cracked support columns, plumbing systems beyond repair, electrical wiring that predated modern safety standards and sparked behind walls inmates slept against. One housing unit, in particular, became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The North Cell House, originally designed to hold a controlled population under strict supervision, it had become overcrowded, understaffed, and structurally compromised. Inspectors warned that continued use posed serious safety risks. And yet, the unit remained occupied, because moving inmates requires space elsewhere, and Illinois had none. This is where the reality of mass incarceration collided head-on with infrastructure limits. The state faced a choice: shut down units and release pressure elsewhere, or keep housing inmates in buildings everyone knew were deteriorating. They chose to delay. Months passed, then years, until finally, the warning language changed again. This time it was urgent, the condemnation. When the order came, it wasn't gradual. It was sudden. Entire housing units were condemned, forcing administrators to relocate hundreds of inmates in a matter of days. Cells were sealed, doors welded shut. Sections of the prison were effectively erased overnight. For inmates, the experience was disorienting. Men who had lived in the same cells for years were suddenly ordered to pack what little they owned, sometimes in garbage bags, and move without explanation. Some were transferred to other prisons. Others were crammed into remaining units already stretched past capacity. There was no sense of stability. And instability inside a prison like Stateville is dangerous. Tension spiked immediately, because when inmates are displaced suddenly, established hierarchies collapse. And when hierarchies collapse, conflict follows. Lockdown as a way of life. At Stateville, lockdowns were not rare emergencies. They were routine. Sometimes triggered by fights. Sometimes by contraband discoveries. Sometimes simply because staffing levels dropped too low to safely move inmates. Entire units would be sealed for days, then weeks, then months. During lockdowns, movement stopped. Meals were delivered cell to cell. Showers were rationed. Recreation vanished. For men, already confined 23 hours a day, lockdowns turned isolation into something heavier. Former inmates would later describe the psychological toll as worse than physical discomfort. Time blurred, days lost structure. The world outside the cell shrank to concrete walls and steel bars. Mental health staff were overwhelmed. Men with serious psychiatric conditions were housed in environments that intensified symptoms rather than treating them. And Stateville's mental health units, already under scrutiny, began drawing national attention. Mental health behind concrete. Stateville was designated as a facility responsible for housing inmates with severe mental illness. On paper, that meant access to treatment. In practice, it meant crowding vulnerable men into a system that could barely function. Cells intended for observation became long-term housing. Medication schedules were disrupted by lockdowns. Therapy was replaced with containment. Advocacy groups began documenting cases where inmates deteriorated rapidly after transfer to Stateville. Federal lawsuits followed. The language used by attorneys was stark: systemic indifference, deliberate neglect, foreseeable harm. And once again, the state responded not with closure, but with temporary fixes, staffing adjustments, policy revisions, promises, but the core problem remained untouched. Stateville was too old, too crowded, too damaged to function as intended. And still, men continued to arrive. Lifers, forgotten men in the passage of time. For inmates serving decades or life sentences, Stateville was not a temporary crisis. It was home. Men arrived in their 20s and watched their hair turn gray inside the same walls. They learned every crack in the concrete, every routine shift change, every sound that meant tension was rising. Some adapted. They found purpose in routine jobs, in education programs when available, in mentoring younger inmates trying to survive their first years. Others withdrew completely. Years of confinement inside an unstable environment eroded trust, not just in the system, but in people. And this is where Stateville's story becomes quieter, but heavier, because not all damage leaves visible scars. A prison doesn't need constant violence to destroy people. Sometimes neglect is enough. The outside world moves on. While Stateville struggled internally, the world beyond its walls changed. Prison reform debates intensified. Media scrutiny increased. New standards were introduced. Standards Stateville could not meet without massive investment. Eventually, the state acknowledged what many had known for years. Stateville, as it existed, could not continue forever. Plans were drafted. Replacement facilities were proposed. Closure timelines were discussed. But prisons do not disappear overnight. And until the final door closes, the men inside still live with the consequences of every delayed decision. Cliff edge where the story turns. Stateville Correctional Center is now living on borrowed time. Its future is uncertain. But its past is already written in lawsuits, in medical records, in the memories of those who survived its walls. When the walls couldn't hide it anymore. For decades, Stateville existed in a kind of isolation. It was known to attorneys, known to families of inmates, known to staff who worked there and left quietly. But it wasn't truly known to the public. That changed when the lawsuit stopped being isolated complaints and became patterns. Case after case began telling the same story. Different inmates, different years, same conditions. Extended lockdowns without justification. Medical delays measured in months, not days. Mentally ill inmates deteriorating in environments that amplified instability. Judges began using unusually blunt language. Not cautious, not diplomatic. They described Stateville as a facility that could not meet constitutional standards under its current conditions. This was no longer about individual mistakes. It was about structural failure. And once those words entered the public record, the pressure intensified. The staff who spoke and the ones who didn't. Behind the scenes, morale among correctional officers had been eroding for years. Veteran staff retired early. New recruits burned out fast. Mandatory overtime became routine. Some officers began speaking to investigators anonymously. Their accounts were consistent. They weren't trained to handle the level of mental illness they encountered. They weren't given the staffing needed to safely manage housing units. They were asked to maintain order in buildings that physically worked against them, but just as many stayed silent. Because prisons have their own culture, one where speaking out can isolate you as quickly as it isolates inmates. And silence became part of how Stateville continued operating. Medical care or the lack of it. If overcrowding strained Stateville's walls, medical neglect strained its conscience. Stateville was responsible for housing aging inmates, many serving life sentences, men with chronic conditions, men whose bodies were breaking down inside a system designed for punishment, not care. Medical units were understaffed, appointments delayed by lockdowns. Transfers to outside hospitals required layers of approval. In some cases, symptoms were documented repeatedly before action was taken. Advocates described a system where treatment followed paperwork, not urgency. And when care fails in prison, inmates have no alternatives. They cannot seek second opinions. They cannot leave. They cannot advocate beyond grievance forms that often went unanswered. For families on the outside, this created a unique kind of helplessness. They called, they wrote, they waited. Sometimes, the first confirmation that something had gone wrong was a phone call that came too late. Aging inside Stateville. As years passed, a noticeable shift occurred inside the population. Stateville was no longer dominated solely by younger inmates. It housed men in their 50s, 60s, and beyond, many who had spent most of their adult lives inside prison walls. Facilities were not designed for walkers or wheelchairs. Cells were not designed for mobility limitations. Lockdowns were not designed for fragile health. And yet, these men remained. Because sentences do not shorten simply because bodies fail. The final admission. Eventually, even state officials could no longer avoid the obvious. Stateville Correctional Center, as it existed, was beyond repair. Reports concluded that renovation would cost nearly as much as replacement, without guaranteeing compliance with modern standards. The decision was no longer whether Stateville had failed. It was what to do next. Plans emerged for closure and replacement, new facilities, modern designs, promises of better conditions. But those plans came with timelines measured in years. And until those timelines ended, Stateville remained operational, still holding men, still aging, still decaying, a prison declared obsolete, yet still in use. Pause point, the final descent. In the final chapters, we will confront the hardest questions. What happens to inmates when a prison is officially deemed unfit, but not yet closed? Who is held accountable when failure spans generations of leadership? And what does Stateville leave behind, not just in concrete and steel, but in the men who live and age inside it? The ending of this story is not loud. It is quiet, administrative, and deeply unsettling. A prison waiting to die. In its final years, Stateville existed in a strange state of suspension. It was still operational, still staffed, still receiving inmates. But everyone inside knew the truth. Stateville was a prison waiting to die. Maintenance stopped being proactive and became purely reactive. Repairs were no longer about longevity, only about preventing immediate catastrophe. Entire sections sat dark and sealed, like abandoned wings of a hospital no longer treating patients. Inmates noticed the change first. Programs quietly disappeared. Transfers slowed. Movement became more restricted, not because of discipline, but because fewer staff were willing to manage crumbling infrastructure. Stateville was shrinking from the inside, and the men who remained felt it, because when an institution knows its end is coming, it stops investing, not just in buildings, but in people. The feeling of being left behind. For inmates serving long sentences, the announcement of eventual closure brought no relief. There were no guarantees of where they would go, no timelines they could trust, no assurances that conditions would improve after transfer. Some feared being scattered across the state, separated from what little stability they had built. Others feared something worse, being forgotten entirely, because prisons close on paper, but inmates carry the experience with them, and Stateville's imprint was deep, the human cost that never made headlines. Not every story inside Stateville ended in a lawsuit. Most ended quietly. Men who withdrew from programs. Men whose health declined without incident reports. Men who stopped expecting anything beyond survival. Former inmates would later describe a specific kind of exhaustion, not physical but emotional. The exhaustion of realizing that nothing was going to change while you were there. That realization reshapes behavior. Hope becomes dangerous. Routine becomes protection. Emotion becomes liability. Stateville did not need constant violence to harm people. It used time, years of it, the staff who stayed until the end. Not everyone inside Stateville was trapped by a sentence. Some chose to stay. Correctional officers who worked decades inside a failing institution. Medical staff who tried to deliver care under impossible constraints. Administrators balancing public scrutiny with political reality. Many of them left changed. They had enforced rules in buildings they knew were unsafe. They had watched conditions deteriorate without the authority to stop it. They had become part of the system that asked them to manage consequences rather than causes. Stateville didn't just house trauma. It produced it. What Stateville leaves behind. When a prison closes, the state speaks in neutral terms. Decommissioned, replaced, transitioned. But prisons do not disappear cleanly. They leave records. They leave memories. They leave people. Stateville leaves behind men who aged inside its walls. Families who spent decades visiting a facility everyone agreed was broken. Staff who carried its failures home with them. It also leaves a warning. Because Stateville did not collapse overnight. It declined gradually through delay, compromise, and acceptance of the unacceptable. And that is how systems fail most often. Not through catastrophe, but through tolerance. The ghost of Stateville. Stateville Correctional Center was never just concrete and steel. It was an idea that surveillance could replace humanity, that overcrowding could be managed indefinitely. That delay was cheaper than reform. For nearly a century, that idea held men inside its walls. Some survived it, some did not. All were shaped by it. When the final doors close, the buildings may fall silent, but the legacy won't. Because Stateville exists now in court records and medical files, in memories that don't fade easily. It exists as a reminder of what happens when a system designed to punish forgets how to protect. And somewhere in Illinois, the land will eventually be cleared. New structures will rise. New promises will be made. But the question remains, not just for Illinois, but for every place still relying on prisons like Stateville. Have we learned anything at all? Don't let this story end here. Stateville Correctional Center will eventually disappear from the landscape. The concrete will be torn down. The steel will be hauled away. The land will be repurposed, renamed, and reclaimed. But what happened inside those walls will not vanish so easily. Because prisons don't just hold people. They hold decisions, delays, and the consequences of what society chooses to tolerate. Men aged inside Stateville while the system debated timelines. Families waited while reports were written and rewritten. And a prison everyone knew was failing continued to operate because it was easier than fixing it. If the story made you uncomfortable, that's the point. If it made you angry, that matters. And if it made you think, then this story did its job. If you believe stories like this deserve to be seen, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that these realities shouldn't be buried. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what happens behind prison walls long after the headlines fade. And if you want more deep, investigative prison documentaries, stories that don't look away, don't rush, and don't sanitize the truth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because there are more places like Stateville, more systems under strain, and more stories that haven't been told yet. This was inside Stateville Correctional Center. Thank you for watching.